Hello, welcome back to the channel. It's me, Emmy the Cat Lady, and we are starting a new Science of Fallout series today, where we're going to talk about immortality and Fallout. So, throughout the Fallout series, we encounter a number of people who were born before 2077, meaning that they predate the bombs falling. We even get to play as one in Fallout 4. Obviously, a lot of these people are ghouls, but there are some that are not and that have found another way to survive. So before we get into the details, I think it might help to look at some definitions and some nuance around what we mean by immortality, because you can interpret it in different ways. There's an interesting theory about the lifespan of animals, that the total amount of heartbeats is very similar regardless of size. So an example that's given on the BBC Science Focus magazine website is that a hamster's heart beats around 400 times a minute and they live for around 4 years, which would add up to 840 million heartbeats. While an elephant has a heart rate of 35 beats per minute and lives for about 35 years, totaling about 640 million heartbeats in total. So the theory is that somewhere in that kind of region of heartbeats is kind of the upper limit. So it depends on the size of the species, because bigger animals tend to have slower heart rates, smaller animals tend to have faster heart rates. Humans can expect to reach a much higher number of heartbeats because of our ability to survive and advances in things like medicine that we have. Of course, these numbers don't really take into account things like predation and disease tendencies, but it's an interesting thought that there is a hard level cap on our existence. There is another limiting factor called the Hayflick limit, which we'll talk about a bit later on. So if you look up in the dictionary, immortality is defined as unending life, so living forever. Makes sense, right? But living forever can be interpreted in different ways. You could talk about literally, physically living forever. Your body never dies and you keep going on indefinitely. Kind of like the vampires in the Buffyverse, except they can die if they're killed. They're still immortal, as they won't die naturally like living things do. And you could say that they're technically undead because they don't have a pulse and they don't have an oxygen requirement. So being truly immortal could mean being invincible as well, so you can't die, can't be killed, can't be destroyed in any way, which sounds great on paper, but when the eventual heat death of the universe comes around, what are you going to do? A spiritual view would suggest that our souls are immortal even if our bodies are not, so after death the soul lives on somewhere else, whether it's heaven, hell, Valhalla, Nirvana, or simply you're reincarnated into a new body and a new life. Many deities of many different religions are also considered to be immortal even if they do have physical bodies, like the Olympians of Greece that were believed to live on Mount Olympus, but they were immortal. So there are views that remaining alive and conscious counts even if the physical existence is no longer their own body, but in a computer or something like that. So your mind lives on even if the body is dust. We will get back to this idea later on. Biological immortality is similar, except it means that the animal doesn't age or die of old age, but could still die from injury or disease, and we'll be getting back to that point a bit later on as well. So the less tangible kind of immortality is by reputation or being memorable, so people who are remembered for a long time after they've died, or things that they have created, keep them in the minds of people for generations after their death. A few well-known examples: Marilyn Monroe died in 1962, but she's still remembered as an actress and a sex symbol. William Shakespeare's been dead for over 400 years, but we still study his work and see adaptations of his plays now. Henry VIII died in 1547, yet what he did in his life still has ramifications now by creating the Church of England to replace the Catholic Church so that he could divorce Catherine of Aragon, and they've literally made a musical about his 6 wives. So something that, you know, he still has quite a reputation even after all this time. So there's a few different ways that someone can be immortal, and we do encounter a few of these in Fallout. So it's said that there are 2 things in this life that are certain: death and taxes. Absolutely, this is true in our world, and even in Fallout, taxes are still a thing in some places, notably the NCR. But death, that comes for us all in the end. It doesn't matter how often you exercise, how healthy your diet is, you're going to leave this mortal plane at some point. Does this rule apply to all living things? Are you surprised that the answer is no? There are living things that can keep themselves alive for a long time, perhaps indefinitely. Organisms have two different methods that they can use to survive for a long period of time. The first one is similar to cryogenic stasis, which we saw employed in Vault 111 to keep the residents alive forever, and also in Vault 31 in the TV show to preserve Buds, the junior executives of Vault Tech. Some single-celled organisms can sporulate, which means forming a spore that's protected by a thick cell wall and can lie dormant for years, sometimes even decades. So the spore allows the bacteria to resist heat, dehydration, and most disinfectants. Some of the most important bacteria that can do this is Bacillus anthracis, the bacteria responsible for anthrax. This bacteria has major implications for public health. It is a potent pathogen in livestock and it has to be ruled out in cases of sudden death in cattle in the UK. And I mean that immediately. You have a patient-side test that you can do with a little tiny bit of blood to test for anthrax in the field so that you know if that's what's happened to this cow, and then that can be dealt with because it's a notifiable disease, which means that a vet that diagnoses it has to report it to the government. And it affects grazing animals because these spores can survive in the soil for decades, 50 years plus. The other issue is that this infection is extremely serious and can be transmitted to humans. Infection requires antibiotics for 2 months and usually intensive care hospitalisation, so it's very, very serious. Some people sort of millennial age will probably remember this from a couple of decades ago, but the spores of anthrax can even be considered a biological weapon. So scary stuff. And there are other infectious organisms that can operate like this, including some viruses. So one example is canine parvovirus, which is a tiny virus. It's really, really tiny one, and it has a protein capsule rather than a lipid capsule. So it's the outside of it is made of protein instead of fat. And soap doesn't work because of that, because soap emulsifies fat that allows it to kill the virus. But with parvovirus, that's not the case because it has a protein capsule instead. So normal soap doesn't work. It can survive dehydration as well, and most of your typical cleaning and disinfectant agents are actually not effective against it. And that means that parvovirus can also persist in the environment for decades, especially in things like concrete and soil. In order to get rid of it, you need to use bleach or other specialised disinfectants, which are pretty nasty chemically, so, you know, really quite an unpleasant thing. And parvovirus is a very serious infection in dogs and deadly to puppies, unfortunately. I have seen the devastating effect this virus can have on breeding premises and things like that, and it was really horrible to fight so hard to try and save all these puppies and not managing to save all of them. It is something that's a common issue for puppies that are imported, certainly to the UK, and puppies that are coming from these puppy farms as well. And once it's in the environment, it is really difficult to get rid of it because you have to use these specialised disinfectants and things. So very, very serious thing. Obviously, these are kind of very simple organisms, biologically speaking. More complex organisms like animals can do something similar, but for a much shorter time frame. An example would be something like hibernation, which is employed by a lot of different species as a way to survive harsh winters when food is scarce. The idea is that they go into a state where they're reducing their energy consumption and conserving as much as possible in order to survive the winter, so reducing their metabolic rate, sometimes reducing their body temperature, which reduces heart rate, blood pressure, respiratory rate, and oxygen consumption, so everything just slows down. Some animals will eat a large amount of food in the autumn and build up fat deposits in the body, which then acts as a storage of energy to survive the hibernation period. Other species will stash food away nearby and kind of wake up and eat potentially during the course of the winter. For some species, they are kind of hardwired to use this period for pregnancy, particularly black bears hibernate while pregnant and generally give birth towards the end of the hibernation period. Their physiology is designed for that, which is really quite interesting. Endothermic animals, which are animals that are considered warm-blooded, like ground squirrels, rodents, European hedgehogs, monotremes like the echidna and marsupials are all examples that hibernate, as well as bears and bats. We already know quite well that they tend to hibernate over the winter. Bears have this unique ability to recycle their urine and recycle their proteins, which means that they essentially don't urinate for months, and this helps prevent them from losing a lot of muscle mass during the hibernation period. When we look at ectotherms, which is your cold-blooded species, so tortoises, lizards, they hibernate or brumate. Generally, brumation is the term that's used in reptiles because it's a wee bit different. Captive reptiles might not need to go through the hibernation period, but you do notice that they'll slow down a bit and eat less during the winter, even when they're in an artificial environment. In invertebrates like insects, it's known as diapause, but it's a similar kind of idea. The need or ability to hibernate is generally a survival strategy for the cold months when food is less available. So not all species of these examples do that. Particularly African tortoises don't hibernate because their native environment never gets cold enough for them to need to do so, and their diet is typically available all year round. There's also not really consensus on whether captive tortoises need to be hibernated at all, whether it's healthier for them to hibernate or to not hibernate. They can be a bit prone to having health problems after hibernation when they wake up. So I'm not 100% convinced, because the main purpose of hibernation is to survive a lack of food over the winter, which in captive animals isn't really an issue. However, there are some species that actually go a step further than this and are basically allow themselves to freeze over the winter, so they literally survive frozen. Fish, amphibians and some reptiles can do this, and they wake up when the temperatures rise again in the springtime. And these species have actually evolved to produce a kind of protein in their blood that works like antifreeze, which is really quite interesting. So that protects their circulatory system from freezing, and then they just stay frozen until it warms up again, and then they wake up. So very close to what we would talk about with cryogenic stasis. So it is something that can happen in some animals at least. So can that be done in humans? There is ongoing research into methods of inducing suspended animation in humans. It could have some applications for healthcare, a step up from things like induced comas to treat seriously ill or injured people, and also potentially relevant for space travel. And it is something that you see in a lot of kind of space sci-fi media where people are travelling, hundreds of light years away, so they get put into some kind of stasis on the ship so that they don't age out and die en route kind of things. So to understand how this kind of thing might work, we need to look at what actually happens at the point of death. And we know that the brain will begin to die after 4 to 5 minutes without oxygen. So if there's no circulation or oxygenation happening, then you have got a few minutes before brain damage is likely to occur. The term somatic death is when the clinical signs of death occur, and you have to generally have more than one of these, ideally all of them, to confirm death. So no heart function at all, no breathing function, and no brain function. So cardiac arrest means no heartbeat, but this isn't the same as a heart attack. It's a bit of a different thing, and the cells will keep functioning for a few hours after cardiac arrest has occurred. So there is a number of factors that have to be checked before a person can officially be declared as deceased. It does take the muscle cells a couple of hours to begin to die after circulation stops, and this is why CPR can revive someone if the heart stops beating. And contrary to popular belief, the most important part of CPR is the chest compressions, not the defibrillator, the chest compressions, which must be done fast enough and hard enough to pump the heart and keep the blood moving around the body. So if you're doing it right, you are liable to potentially crack a few ribs while you're doing it. If it happens during surgery, and if it's possible to do so, a surgeon may actually open the chest and do direct cardiac massage instead, which is more effective, but obviously comes with a lot more risks. If the patient does get their heart rate back and survive, then there's more risk of kind of complications from doing that. The second most important part of CPR is providing oxygen and breathing, so putting a tube in and ventilating, or using the ambu bag, the squeezy bag that they use to provide fresh oxygen into the lungs. This keeps the cells of the body, especially the brain, from dying and increases the chances of a successful resuscitation. However, in a lot of cases, CPR is much more likely to fail than succeed, unfortunately. It depends a lot on the situation and if you've got someone that kind of knows what they're doing. So it's a really good skill to have, is to know how to do CPR and what to do in a situation where somebody collapses or something like that, because a lot of the time these situations happen outside the hospital where there's trained, qualified people to do it. So knowing how to do CPR and taking a course on that is definitely a good thing to have. But people have survived hypothermic situations where they've been kind of frozen or in really, really cold water, and they've believed to go into a kind of hibernation-like state. If you've watched Grey's Anatomy, then you'll know the phrase, they're not dead until they're warm and dead, and this also applies to hamsters. Many hamsters have been assumed to be dead, but have actually just been hibernating because they've got too cold. So it is something to kind of bear in mind if somebody is in that situation and they're freezing cold, they've been stuck outside in a blizzard or something like that. You can't really be sure that they're definitely deceased until they're warmed up, so keep that in mind. In medical settings, they will sometimes use induced hypothermia for open heart surgery instead of using a machine to take over the heart and lung functions, so actually deliberately reducing the patient's body temperature. There are risks to that because it does mean that the surgeon has kind of limited time to perform the procedure, but there are certain situations where it might be the safest option for the patient, and there is research into this that's ongoing, including into cryogenic stasis. So it does seem entirely possible for this to happen. And the important factors are that the person's body is preserved with minimal cell death and damage, and that they are able to be revived afterwards using some kind of CPR. So whether this technology will be available in our lifetimes or not, it's impossible to say, but bear in mind a lot of things that are featured in science fiction do end up becoming science facts, so it could happen. And clearly in Fallout, Vault Tech have managed to figure it out. It does seem to involve massive amounts of liquid nitrogen, which we do know can instantly freeze things. And in Vault 31, we know that they had perfected it and successfully revived a number of people. In Vault 111, the lack of oversight meant that eventually the systems failed, and that killed most of the residents. So it does show that relying on a computer system to maintain suspension is potentially dangerous if there's no human oversight. But Vault-Tec research and this kind of stuff does track with their apparent plans for colonisation of other planets, as it is something that could facilitate deep space travel. So, anti-aging is the second method that's employed by living things to prevent aging, and I'm not talking about Botox injections and expensive moisturisers. I'm talking about cellular aging, because that's right, your cells age and eventually can die of old age. It does depend on the cell type, of course, so buckle up for some molecular biology. So, deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA, which is the building block of life, in almost all of the cells in our body, the nucleus holds all of our DNA, again, almost, and it's stored in chromosomes. So chromosomes are little kind of X-shaped chains of DNA, and we have 23 pairs, which includes a pair of sex chromosomes. There can be slight variations on that number for certain things, for example, Down syndrome, but generally the kind of typical is 23 pairs, including a pair of sex chromosomes. And there's also a small amount of DNA in the mitochondria, so they are more than just the powerhouse of the cell, which is obviously the fact that everybody knows. But what that means is that when a cell undergoes mitosis, which is cell division, each chromosome is duplicated so that each new cell has the full set, except this isn't completely achieved. So at each end of the chromosomes are something called telomeres, which are nucleotide sequences that stay at the end, and each time the cell divides and the chromosomes are duplicated, some of that end is lost. Essentially, it's not a perfect copy, so a very small amount of the end of the chain is lost, and once that's completely lost, the cell can no longer divide and it'll die at the end of its natural lifespan. Things like oxidants and other stressors on the body can accelerate this process. So what does that mean? It means that eventually an organism will die of old age, even if it never gets injured or sick. There's a time limit on existence. Well, except for Turritopsis dornii, the immortal jellyfish. These jellyfish can maintain their telomere length during their life cycle and essentially hit the reset button on cellular aging. They then revert to a juvenile stage and start over instead of dying. So quite an impressive thing to achieve, these little jellyfish. So they don't die of old age. They basically just kind of like Benjamin Button, they go back to the beginning and start all over again and start their life cycle all over again. And there are some cell types in the body that do produce telomerases, which are enzymes that can actually restore the telomere length at the end of the chromosomes. Some of these cells include the germ cells, which are the ones that produce your gametes, so your eggs and your sperm. Stem cells, which are cells that haven't differentiated into other body cells and have the potential to become any kind of cell. You find stem cells in umbilical cords, in the bone marrow, and in other organs. Another kind is your activated T cell and B cell lymphocytes, which are part of your immune system. So the B lymphocytes produce the antibodies against viruses and bacteria, and T cells regulate the immune response and help destroy cancerous cells. And speaking of cancer cells, cancer is, by definition, body cells that are growing and dividing out of control, potentially causing damage to the organs and the tissue that they're in. So cancer cells can also produce telomerase, which allows them to keep their replication going indefinitely. And that's inherently the main issue with cancer. So there's an interesting story. I'll link the Wikipedia page about this. So there's something called the HeLa immortal cell line, which has been used in laboratories since 1951. And these are cells that were taken from a woman who had cervical cancer by the name of Henrietta Lacks. She has a very sad story, but quite an interesting one. So I say I'll link it down in the description if you want to have a read. It is a very sad story though, but her cells basically continue to divide and have done for 76 years at this point. So it's kind of an interesting one. So I mentioned in the introduction the Hayflick limit, which is defined as the number of times a normal, differentiated, somatic or body cell can divide before it stops. So telomerase basically prevents this limitation on cell division, which leads to the cells being immortal. So you might be wondering, why are we talking about cells in immortal jellyfish, and what's that got to do with fallout? Well, we know that some people and animals have survived since before the bombs. Telomerase is probably a factor in the extended lifespan of ghouls and ghoulified animals. Possibly one of the mutations is what causes their body cells to produce this enzyme. And we also have a couple of people who have retained their human form all this time, particularly looking at the residents of Vault 112, including Dr. Braun and, of course, Mr. House. So when we see Robert House's real body, he looks his age, but the machinery has kept him alive all this time, so it's entirely possible that telomerase is something that is involved in the preservation of his physical body. And I would say the same possibly applies to Dr. Braun and the other residents of Vault 112, who all appear as elderly humans when they're inside their pods. You can kind of see through the pod to see them there. And obviously these methods are imperfect. We know that if you open Mr. House's stasis chamber and don't actively kill him, he will end up dying fairly shortly from exposure to microbes, which means that his immune system in his body is no longer able to cope with infections or any kind of outside exposure. So that alone will eventually kill him. And he even says that he would rather you just killed him outright instead of leaving him there to die slowly with no control over anything, which is kind of a cruel thing to do, to be fair. And if you're doing Tranquility Lane and you're talking to Dr. Braun, you can tell him that he can live in the real world again, and what he says is very, very interesting. He says, my body's been seated in the same chair for 200 years, it's sustained by machines, were I to so much as stand up, my body would crumble to dust. So that tells us that he's aware that while his body is still alive, if he were to leave his tranquility lounger, he would die. His body has still aged despite the life support that the vault system is providing. And for him and the other residents, he could be lying because he doesn't want to leave his virtual world, but he could also be telling the truth, and that his body is no longer equipped to cope with the world outside his little VR pod. So it would make sense that in both of these cases, they are using some biological means to keep their physical bodies alive, so that it's connected to their mind and to their brain and the function of the pods and things. So very, very interesting kind of side to things. And I think the jellyfish, it's really, really interesting as well that these immortal jellyfish just live at the bottom of the ocean, and they just kind of Benjamin Button their way through life. So it does tell us that there is potential for these kinds of things to exist. And as I said, science fiction can and does become science fact in a lot of ways sometimes. So interesting to see, and I think it's quite an interesting thing to think about. So that's kind of the more biological method of potentially being immortal, but there are other things as well. So next week we are going to talk about some of the more technical methods, so things like cybernetics and putting brains into robots and things like that. So hopefully you'll come back for that and you find this interesting. As always, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and any questions that you have that I haven't answered in the video, anything like that, let me know in the comments. Subscribe if you want to see more, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.